Markos Kounalakis is a foreign affairs columnist for McClatchy News and a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution. He joins me now from San Francisco. Markos, thanks so much for being with us. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says Venezuelan President Maduro was talked out of leaving the country Tuesday morning by the Russians. Let's listen to what he said.
It's been a long time since anyone has seen Maduro. He had an airplane on the tarmac. He was ready to leave this morning, as we understand it, and the Russians indicated he should stay. We think the situation remains incredibly fluid. We know that there were senior leaders inside the Maduro government that were prepared to leave. They told us as much over the past few weeks, and we're convinced that the Venezuelan people are going to get their democracy back.
So if you say he was getting ready to head over to the airport and the Russians talked him out of it, are the Russians responsible now for what's going on?
We've made clear all along, Wolf, that Maduro is surrounded by Cubans and has been supported by Russians there in Venezuela. And we've told the Russians and we've told the Cubans that's unacceptable.
So, Markos, what do you make of that? I mean, why are the Russians getting involved at this point?
Tanya, that's an astounding revelation by the Secretary of State that, in fact, Maduro was ready to leave. The jet was fired up and he waiting on the tarmac for him to leave the country. So let's just pause for a minute and recognize that this is a very fluid situation. And as you say, the Russians are involved, and why would they be doing that? The answer is they are trying to inject themselves geopolitically in as many places as they can. Recall that back during the Obama administration, when it seemed as if we were going to make some moves with Syria, Russia jumped in and actually changed the dynamics of that conflict. That's exactly what's happening here as well. As soon as it seemed as if Maduro was ready to leave the country, Russia informed him, supported him, and said, stick it out because we can get a better deal.
Stick it out because we can get a better deal. It's so interesting to imagine where this could all go. And you bring up Syria, and in a way, the Russians accomplished what they set out to do because Bashar Assad is still in power there in Syria. So one wonders what the end game is here in Venezuela. You know, as we just heard, opposition leader Juan Guaidó has called on military forces to back the uprising. But what could happen if he gets the backing he wants? Does that mean there will be more violence in the streets?
Well, I think both sides really want to prevent there being violent clashes to the extent that there's actually lethal force being used. I think you can see an extension of sort of tear gas and maybe some jostling. I mean, that one image is just heartrending where the APC, the armored personnel carrier, actually ran over or ran into some of the demonstrators. But I think it's in both sides' interests to make sure that this does not escalate. Maduro wants to make sure that it doesn't escalate so that he can eventually, I think, escape the country if he doesn't ride out this current challenge. He will want to leave the country, and he will want to do it not as a criminal, but as someone who is protected, and protections that apparently both Secretary Pompeo and John Bolton have assured us seem to be in place for Maduro to leave. So, no, violence at a lethal state is something everyone wants to avoid.
So if, you know, Pompeo and Bolton say that Maduro can leave with no repercussions, why would he then be going off to Cuba?
Well, that is the game plan, right? For him to leave the country to allow the interim president, Guaidó, to actually take over the instruments of government, to be the leader of the military, all those things that are appropriate for any elected president. But the guarantees are probably for safe passage to Havana, and secondarily, no sort of follow-on repercussions for Maduro, allowing him to sort of have a safe, ongoing life in exile.
But just doesn't all of this make you wonder what the Russians promised him to stay? Because if he was that close to safe passage to Havana and he decided not to go, what did they promise him?
Well, that's really a question that neither you nor I are going to be able to answer, right? This is something that John Bolton knows the answer to, President Trump does, and Mike Pompeo does. But what I can tell you is that the Russians want him to stick it out because they have significant investments in Venezuela. They have spent a lot of money on the petroleum industry in that country, in refineries. They've supported the regime. They see this as important for maintaining some level of some level of presence in Latin America, and not just presence in Venezuela, by the way, in presence in Cuba and presence in Nicaragua.
Right.
I'll take this one more step, which is to say this administration, the Trump administration, is calling Nicaragua, Cuba, and Venezuela the troika of tyranny. I earlier reported that Venezuela could be the tipping point and the start of a Latin spring. If, in fact, Venezuela goes, you can be sure that that pressure is going to be maintained on Cuba and on the really reprehensible regime in Nicaragua.
It will be very interesting to see what happens, for sure. Now, this does start to feel a little bit like a do-or-die moment for Guaidó, right? He's sort of setting it up this way to the people of Venezuela. What happens if the military does not throw its support behind him?
Right. The defections are key. And apparently what the Secretary of State was saying is it sounds as if they've assured him that there are high-level defections within the Venezuelan government, the one that is currently loyal to Maduro. If that is in fact the case, and if that leadership, which has defected, can take along enough of the military with them, then Guaidó is assured of a move into the Miraflores presidential palace.
Right.
If, however, this fails, it will be nothing short of a similar action to what happened with Bay of Pigs, where we encouraged individuals in Cuba and outside of Cuba to start a revolution, to begin a popular movement against a regime that failed terribly because we were unable to back up our assurances.
Right. Encourage people to literally put their lives on the line. But,
yes,
you know, National Security Advisor John Bolton did say all options are on the table to ensure the transition of power. You said earlier everyone wants to see a peaceful transition of power, but that seems to imply that a transition of power, whether it comes peacefully or not, is still on the table. Do you think the Trump administration is ready to send military force?
No. I mean, I'll answer that just straight out no. It would be opposed to everything that President Trump has said from campaign to presidency. And if I may say, I've asserted this in my columns in the past in the Miami Herald, the Trump sovereignty doctrine says that any country can do essentially what it wants within its borders. Here we see an example of where that Trump sovereignty doctrine is conflicting with our regional interests, with a desire to extend and rejuvenate the Monroe Doctrine. And for those viewers who want to refresh what that is, it is essentially saying that Latin America is America's, the United States' backyard, and others are not welcome to be engaged here. And it is also finally a question of whether or not the petropolitics of this are coming into play. We rely to a great degree on Venezuelan oil. We're one of the biggest purchasers of Venezuelan oil. So all those things are in the mix. But when it comes to military action, unless Venezuela goes outside of its borders, do not expect the United States to be directly involved. Now, there may be some other things going on, maybe with Colombia, maybe with Brazil, but the United States and United States forces on the ground will not get engaged here.
So, Markos, if you were to take your best educated guess, what do you think the United States government is promising Guaidó or encouraging him with?
Well, they've told him, it seems, that he actually has defections at the highest levels of the Maduro government, and that those defections will give him the military support, which is key for him to actually take office, to be able to govern, and that once there, they will provide the type of support, whether it be financial, humanitarian, purchases of hydrocarbons, all those things that will allow for a Guaidó government, which would go from interim to acting, to actually be able to govern a very desperate situation in Venezuela, a tough country, one that is impoverished, which has been impoverished both by Maduro and his predecessor, Hugo Chavez. Chavez, I mean, he is going to be stepping into a very, very difficult situation, and the United States had better be there, and I'm sure they've promised that they'll be there to be able to help him financially.
All right. Well, Markos Kounalakis, thank you so much. It'll be very, very interesting to see how this all plays out. It's a fluid situation there in Venezuela. We'll be watching closely over the next 24 and 48 hours. Thank you so much for your insight.
Thanks, Tanya.